The first thing Thomas heard wasn't the wind curling across the desert, nor the restless shifting of his horse behind him, nor even the sharp hum of cicadas buzzing in the heat. It was a voice. A frail, broken whisper leaking through the burlap sack at his feet. "Please don't let them find me again." Those words stopped him cold. He tugged at the knot with rough, work-hardened hands, the coarse fibers scraping his fingers. The sack loosened, and when he pulled it away, he found not some forgotten bundle, not a rustler's stash, not bones left to bleach in the Arizona sun, but a girl. Her face was battered, bruises blooming deep and ugly. A raw strip of skin on her bare shoulder told where the rope had chewed at her flesh. Her eyes had sunk so far into their sockets, it was as though hope itself had abandoned her long ago. She looked at him the way a wounded deer looks at the hunter who raises his rifle, a gaze that begged for mercy but expected none. Thomas McGra, a rancher pushing 50, had seen plenty in his time. He had lived through the war between the states, buried comrades, and watched men fall young and hard in battles fought over dirt and pride. But this was something else entirely. The desert could be cruel, yes, but cruelty of this kind didn't belong to nature. This was the work of men, deliberate and merciless. For a long moment he couldn't speak. Words caught in his throat like sand in a dry wind. He wanted to promise her she was safe, but all he could do was kneel there in the dust, staring into those hollow eyes that still clung to life by a thread. Somewhere a crow cried, black wings cutting the orange sky, as if mocking him with the sound of death. And Thomas knew then and there that nothing about his life would ever be the same again. Once you've looked into eyes like hers, you cannot simply ride away. He gave her water, only a sip at first. Too much would have killed her faster than thirst. She coughed hard, the sound tearing at her throat, but she swallowed again. Minutes passed before she found her voice, thin and wavering, nearly lost to the desert breeze. She told him her name was Mary Lou. She was just 22, though the suffering etched into her features made her look older. A week ago, she'd left Bisbee in her wagon, heading to Tombstone to visit kin. On the road, 3 men stopped her. Not miners, not vagrants. These were hardened riders with faces that branded themselves into memory. They called themselves the San Pedro Riders, a name passed in whispers around saloons but never spoken too loud. Outlaws, smugglers, kidnappers, the kind who dealt in human flesh. Mary Lou had thought at first they wanted her wagon or her money. But no. They told her plainly, she was headed south, across the border, to be sold. She dared not describe the place they spoke of, but her eyes said enough. Thomas felt his stomach nod as she spoke. He'd heard rumors of such things, but hearing it from her lips was different. It hollowed him. She told him the riders had led her down by the San Pedro River, keeping her bound like an animal. Then fate intervened, cavalry patrols drew near, the sound of hooves and bugles on the wind. The outlaws panicked. Couldn't risk capture. So they shoved her into that sack, tied it tight, dumped her in the brush, and swore they'd come back for her once the soldiers were gone. Thomas clenched his jaw. Every gust of wind through the mesquite made Mary Lou flinch, as though shadows might spring to life. She was not just afraid of dying, she was afraid of being dragged back. He placed a hand on her arm, firm but careful. He said nothing. Some promises are too fragile to be spoken aloud. That evening, the desert shadows stretched long across the ranch land. Thomas took her home, gave her the small spare room, broth to settle her stomach, and water enough to ease the cracks in her lips. For the first time in days, she lay down to sleep without a sack covering her head. But peace is a thin thing on the frontier. It began with the dogs. Their barking was sharp, steady, and low, the kind of bark that means trouble, not play. Then came the slow grind of hooves on the dirt road, deliberate, heavy, carrying the weight of menace with each step. Thomas stepped out onto his porch, rifle in hand. The last red light of sunset stretched across the horizon, and there, at the edge of his yard, a lone rider reined in his horse. His hat was pulled low, shadowing his face, but his eyes gleamed mean under the brim. One of the San Pedro riders had come calling. He didn't need to say it, but he did anyway, his voice oily and certain. He had found them. The man's arrogance dripped from every word as he sneered, claiming the girl was his property, and that Thomas had no right to interfere. But Thomas McGrath was not the kind to waste breath arguing with evil men. The war had carved that lesson into him deep. Shouting never moved a wicked heart. Instead, he lifted his Winchester, steady as a preacher's hand on Sunday, and told the outlaw to turn around. No threats, no rage, just the calm voice of a man who had seen too much death to play at bravado. The outlaw's eyes narrowed, his hand twitching near his pistol. For a heartbeat, the desert itself seemed to hold still. Then, with a curse and a glob of spit in the dust, the man yanked his reins and wheeled his horse away. He rode off, but Thomas knew it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Behind the curtain, Marilou clutched the fabric tight, her chest heaving. For the first time in longer than she could remember, someone had stood between her and the devils who'd haunted her steps. Tears streamed down her bruised face, not from weakness but from the strange, fragile gift Thomas had given her, safety. Thomas lowered his rifle, scanning the horizon. Men like that didn't disappear. They circled back, meaner than before, carrying vengeance like a sickness. Tonight was only the start of what was coming. And folks, if you're still following Thomas and Marilou's story, you already know, hard times have a way of getting harder. So stay close, because what came next would freeze the blood in your veins. The desert night rolled in sharp and restless. Thomas sat with his rifle near, waiting. He didn't wait long. Soon the sound of hooves thundered across the hard earth, 3 shadows riding fast beneath the moon. The first outlaw fired from behind a stand of mesquite. His bullet shattered the porch rail inches from Thomas's head. In the same breath, Thomas dropped low, sighted his rifle, and answered. The outlaw pitched forward into the dirt, lifeless before his horse even knew he was gone. The second man came roaring from the corral, gun in hand, hollering curses as he fired wild. Thomas aimed, not at him, but at the beast beneath him. The shot rang true, the horse reared and crashed to the ground, crushing its rider. The outlaw's scream tore through the night as he clutched his ribs, too broken to stand. But the third one was smarter. He circled wide, slipping behind the house. A sudden crack split the silence, and Thomas staggered, a bullet burning through his shoulder. He stumbled against the porch post, vision dimming, blood soaking his shirt. Even then, he raised the Winchester, squeezed the trigger, and dropped the outlaw with a shot to the leg. The wounded man howled, dragging himself closer, pistol slipping from his fingers as he crawled for one last desperate strike. That was when Marilou appeared. Fear still lived in her eyes, but something stronger burned behind it. She gripped a heavy iron skillet with both hands, raised it high, and brought it down hard across the outlaw's skull. He crumpled to the dirt, unconscious. Thomas pressed a trembling hand to his wound, breath coming ragged. Marilou stood over the fallen man, skillet still raised, as though daring the night itself to rise up against her. The second outlaw, broken but breathing, pulled himself onto another horse and fled into the darkness, too battered to fight and too afraid to stay. Silence returned, broken only by Thomas's uneven breaths and Marilou's trembling voice as she knelt beside him. Her hands shook as she pressed cloth to his bleeding shoulder. In her wide eyes, Thomas saw the same dread that clawed at his own gut. This wasn't finished. A man who ran didn't run forever. When dawn came, the desert bloomed gold and crimson across the horizon. Thomas sat on the porch, his shoulder bound in rough cloth, while Marilou stayed close, quiet but watchful. In the barn, the outlaw she had struck lay tied and groaning. Soon after, a rider appeared from the trail, Sheriff Caldwell, an old comrade from the war. Word of gunfire had reached him before dawn, and he'd followed the tracks straight here. He dismounted, every step carrying the steady weight Thomas remembered from battlefield days. They clasped hands, no words needed. Caldwell took charge of the wounded outlaw, vowing to pry the truth from him and see justice done. Before leaving, he paused and studied Thomas with the eyes of a man who had once stood in the same storm of death. "Do you remember Cold Harbor?" he asked, voice low. "When the sky turned black with smoke and we thought the sun would never rise again?" Thomas nodded slowly. The memories returned in waves, the choking air, the stench of powder and blood, and the unshakable bond of men who swore never to leave one another standing alone. The sheriff laid a hand gently on Thomas's good shoulder. "That fight is still in you, old friend. Don't let it die." Before riding off, he warned of the outlaw who had escaped. A man like that always left a trail. And the law, with men like Caldwell at its back, would not stop chasing. The ranch fell quiet once more. Marilou brought Thomas water and sat beside him. Her eyes no longer showed only fear, but something softer, steadier. She asked why he risked himself for her when it would have been easier to keep walking that first night. Thomas didn't answer right away. He looked out at the horizon, then said, "A man who walks past suffering and does nothing isn't a man worth remembering." The words struck her deep, and maybe they strike us too. Out here on the frontier, or anywhere in this world, we all face those moments. Turn away or stand our ground. So I'll ask you, if you'd been in Thomas's boots, would you have kept walking or stayed and fought? The days that followed were quiet but changed. Marilou began to laugh again, faint but real, helping with chores around the ranch. For the first time since Bisbee, she felt safe. Thomas still bore the pain in his shoulder, but along with it came something lighter, a reminder that even in a broken land, hope could grow back if you were stubborn enough to hold your ground. And friends, if this tale stirred something in you, do me a favor. Tap that like, subscribe, and stay with us. There are more stories from the frontier, stories of courage, sacrifice, and love. Stories that never lose their fire. And maybe, just maybe, the next one will leave you with a question you can't shake.